Crispin Sartwell, how are you?
Good, Dan. How are you, man?
I am doing all right. It is, as we draw near the end of the summer, I have this creeping feeling of dread sort of rising up in my guts.
Yeah.
And this summer in particular, I don't know, I really sank into deep laziness.
Okay, yeah. I tried to mobilize this summer, get it back together, lose 10 pounds, just get in shape, do home improvement. I tried to mobilize, but then I kind of collapsed again.
You do look pretty damn good, I have to say.
Oh, thanks, man.
Did you actually, have you been you look like, did you lose weight?
I did lose a little weight.
You didn't need it, but you did. I think you did.
Thanks,
no, and all joking aside, I think that 6 weeks in New York hit me harder than I realized.
Yeah.
I've been kind of listless the whole summer. I find it hard to get motivated.
You had a hell of a lot to deal with in the spring and exhausting stuff to deal with, right?
With my dad, yeah. And I think we did a dialogue while I was there, I think.
Yeah.
And I think I underestimated how much that took out of me. I think that pretty much wiped me out for the summer.
Yeah.
But
emotionally must have been really difficult.
Yeah. You've had to scrap and scrape and struggle a lot your whole life, but for me, this is the first really tough thing I ever faced.
Wow, yeah.
I've never really faced anything really hard. It
is really tough what you're describing, man. You've been through, yeah.
All right, so I'm with Crispin Sartwell, of course. A favorite. Professor of philosophy at Dickens, our associate professor?
Yeah.
At Dickinson College. When do you come up for your full final promotion?
I keep suggesting that they might want to promote me, and they keep not promoting me. That's all I can say.
It doesn't go by a standard 5-year chunk?
Well, it ought to, and I ought to be a full professor, but I'm not, is what I could say.
Okay, yeah. The way we do it is it's every 5 years you have to sort of apply. There's this whole process. And you can go up for early promotion, but it's usually frowned upon. Anyway.
It's late for me.
Yeah. Well, that's because you're a troublemaker, and
kind of.
It's why I love you. But
thanks.
It's probably why administrations don't.
Yeah, you may have a point.
They don't like me very much either, but. Whenever the administration and passes tried to fuck with me, I've adopted such an overwhelmingly menacing posture in response. I've actually told the vice president that I would sue him until he was living under a box under a bridge. Well,
it kind of reached that kind of point with me too. But anyway, yeah.
It works, I mean, it's a certain.
Unless
you're not loved afterwards, you're not sort of,
Yeah, you got to try to intimidate these people, or they'll fuck with you forever, man.
Yeah, and their internal processes are all stacked against you, and so you never ever want to cooperate with those. Is what I've found. I just always bring a lawyer to everything, and that just seems to cut through a lot.
Oh God. Okay. Been there, bro.
One day we'll have to, it's too bad that you're a recovering drinker, because we need to have a conversation about our trials and tribulations.
You never go to a department meeting without a lawyer, and their assistant, their staff or whatever, too. Yeah, just bring an entourage of your legal representation, and everything. Yeah.
So today we're going to, and I'm Daniel Kaufman, of course. Welcome to the Sophia audience, blindheads.tv, meaningoflife.tv. I'm very glad to have Crispin back. After a little hiatus, Crispin. We're here to talk about an article that Crispin published not too long ago in the Philosophical Salon. Now, is that sort of like the LA Review of Books version of sort of like the Times' Stone?
I guess so. Yeah, I mean, except it's a dedicated sub-site, I guess. It's dominated by Zizek.
Do you submit to them, or do they solicit you?
I sent that originally to the Los Angeles Review of Books, and then they said, well, we can't use it exactly, but we'll publish it on this Philosophical Salon site.
Okay. So it's on the Philosophical Salon, which is a philosophy subsection of the LA Review of Books, and it's called Western Philosophy as White Supremacism. And so I'm here to talk with Crispin about it. It is on a related. It's on a related arc to. I did a dialogue with Brian Van Norton, who wrote this book about that Western philosophy is sort of racist, or at least the fact that as we practice Western philosophy, we leave out most of the Eastern tradition, non-Western traditions is racist.
Right.
And so there's a related. It's related, but you have a very specific, distinctive argument to make. I mean,
I basically agree with Van Norton too, but it's a different, definitely a different argument.
Yeah, the argument. It's interesting. The argument I had with him. I mean, I didn't necessarily disagree with the purely descriptive aspect of his criticism. What I disagreed with was kind of the inflection of it, and so. I told him that I thought that what he was attributing to racism, I would be more inclined, at least in analytic departments, to attribute to Philistinism. Because I told him that in the programs I've been and worked in, I would have been much more likely to read Chinese philosophy than Montaigne.
Yeah.
That in a sense, analytic philosophy departments simply just eschew all literary philosophy.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that the traditions that he's interested in are heavily literary in a lot of ways. And so they get kind of excluded, but a lot of literary Western philosophy gets excluded either. I mean, I didn't read one page of Montaigne my entire graduate education.
It's definitely worth reading though.
Oh man, Montaigne is amazing. I teach him. I'm an intro.
Yeah. I love Montaigne.
So we had a nice conversation, everything. This one is a little different, and because it got me a little worked up and upset. Crispin and I had a little exchange on Twitter about this. I want you to tell everyone what the argument is, what you were trying to do, and what the argument is before I start in, so that I'm not mischaracterizing you.
Sure.
So why don't you start off with, what was your idea behind this, and what is the main central point you're trying to make?
Okay. This comes from, this is an idea I guess I had in the early 90s. I was working on my book, Act Like You Know, which is about African-American autobiographies. It's also like an example of white identity studies. And I was teaching African-American thought to like an all-black class at the University of Alabama. And really struggling with this in many dimensions, and getting called on my shit a lot too. Even just the idea that I was an authority on W.E.B. Du Bois or whatever was problematic to my own class and stuff. But anyway, I was like drenched in African-American autobiographies. I was trying to read every African-American autobiography that had ever been published, which is ridiculous, actually. It's impossible, but I thought I could get some ways. And one night I'm in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I kind of sit bolt upright and realize that the structure of anti-black racism is exactly the structure of Cartesian dualism. I guess I was kind of mystified, rummaging around, trying to figure out if there was something that brought all this stuff together. And it just dawned on me, like, this is anti-black racism by white people is just Cartesian dualism. Like, it comes from the same, it just displays entirely the same structure. So it basically, and I think this runs through Western philosophy, like this is maybe the basis of Western philosophy in some ways. We consist, in the Cartesian view, like we consist of two different sorts of things, a physical thing and a spiritual thing, or a physical thing and an intellectual thing. The physical thing is low. It's animal. It's material. But the spiritual, intellectual thing is pure. And the spiritual, intellectual bit, and this is all in Plato, for example, ought to rule the physical animal bit. So you get this kind of picture of the self. I mean, I think this is often the case in philosophy. The way the philosopher pictures the self is actually covertly a political philosophy. Like, okay, so the self is divided into whatever, 4, 5, 2, 17 faculties or whatever. And then you start arranging what parts should rule what other parts. Who should be in control of your body or whatever, okay? Or the body. Or, who should be running yourself. And, Plato's is so the Republic is based on the isomorphism of the individual self and the polis. And the structure, the structures are identical. They're both 3-part things and all of that. And the hierarchy is identical. That is, the philosopher kings should be running the society because they are the minds, and the mind should be running the body because the mind is high and spiritual and beautiful and all that stuff, and the body is gross and material, degrading, disgusting. So now when I start thinking about, it just struck me that all the stereotypes of black people by white people are animalizing. They're constantly emphasizing the status of black people as mere bodies. Like, for example, sexually voracious, for example, or, with a tendency to violent crime, that sort of stuff. Like, people who can't govern their own bodies because they don't have sufficient intellect or something like that. Okay, that's the form of the stereotypes of anti-black racism. Guess what? That is the basic structure of Western metaphysics, if you ask me. It's every friggin' where, all right? And so, my feeling is that as anti-black racism or white supremacism arose in Europe in, let's say, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, it got kind of run through the familiar value hierarchies involved in Western metaphysics. And, it became this kind of imaginary mind-body dualism, except externalized. I called it, ejected dualism or ejected asceticism in Act Like You Know. So, you just, instead of going okay, I'm a body and a mind, and my mind has to conquer and control my body, and then I'll be free, okay, which I think is a bizarre, sick picture of what a human being is and wrong. I'm going to just say, I'm already a pure mind, all right? I'm civilized or whatever. And those people are pure bodies. It's like an externalization of Cartesian dualism. So we're minds, they're bodies. Minds are suited to rule bodies. We're suited to rule them. There basically is no way to morally mistreat people like that because they're animals, okay? And what makes someone morally valuable or human is their intellect, right? And then, I think, we get forms of this later on with just the idea that the experts should be running this sucker. Okay, maybe this idea that maybe sort of Harvard professors should be running this thing or something like that, the meritocracy of mind or something. I think this all reflects, first of all, thousands of years of history of Western metaphysics, and then second, hundreds of years of white supremacism and exploitation of black bodies. I guess that's it.
Okay. So that's good. and I'm glad that you did this, because it probably won't be a surprise to anyone that when I read the essay, I was not just unconvinced, but really quite aggravated. And I thought that I must be misunderstanding, I must be misrepresenting him, or because of my prior orientation, I must be filtering. But now that you've just said this, I see that I was exactly correct. And in terms of my estimation of what the issues are, so let me just start with a number of things. So first of all, I find so it seems to me like right now you've just sort of been flying around a lot. So first I thought this was Cartesian, but then now you started talking about Plato, and it's the Greeks. But of course the Greeks aren't white, and then they can't be white supremacists, and so that comes later. But now it's not. So it's not just modern philosophy. Now it's ancient philosophy. But of course, the Platonic dualism is very different from the Cartesian dualism. The reasons are entirely different. One of the things I think you do that strikes me as a little egregious is I think you interpret these things in such a way that completely ignores the actual intellectual ideology of where the ideas come from, right? And so it gives a false impression, right? But
okay.
Descartes' dualism is a product of his mechanism. It has nothing to do with all of these sorts of things that you want to try to connect it to, right? Descartes was primarily interested in modern physics. I took whole courses on Cartesian science, where the point was to make us understand that the focus on Descartes' dualism is historically anachronistic. It actually is not. It's not what his main interest is in physics. His dualism is a product of the relatively crude physics of the time. So then to start attributing this to take this and now use it in the story you want to tell strikes me as abusing as an historical item, right? I mean, I find one of the things I find your approach very ahistorical. It's revisionist. And I inherently dislike revisionist history because I think revisionist history is essentially propaganda. All right, so let's start first of all, this equivocation between the ancient and the modern. Okay, so maybe you could become clear before we contest the actual argument. Is this thing that you're saying is happening? Does it come out of modern philosophy, or does it come out of ancient philosophy? Or if it comes out of both, what's the story on how it comes out of both, given that modern philosophy is in many ways a reaction against many of the central principles of ancient philosophy? So that's the first thing I want to ask.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I definitely agree with you about is that, to call Plato a white supremacist would just be ridiculous.
It makes no sense, right? I mean,
they don't have
white in any meaningful sense.
Right. They don't. I don't think there are any black and white people in the ancient world, actually. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. Those are
right. They didn't interpret themselves that way.
Right.
They talked about race, maybe, but they didn't at all mean skin color.
No.
Yeah. So, like I say, making Plato or white supremacist or any ancient philosopher would be just ridiculous, okay? That is an ideology that arises in, 16th, 17th century at the earliest.
That's right.
One thing is, I think that Plato's dualism is very similar to Descartes' dualism in many ways. And that's not that surprising. I mean, modern philosophy, one thing is it was characterized by it was led into by a rediscovery of a lot of these ancient texts and stuff like this, or just a rereading of Plato and Aristotle and all that.
No, but before you go on, just on this particular thing about Platonism and Cartesianism, okay, I really have to resist this. Look, the fundamental core element of ancient philosophy is the metaphysical reality of form, okay?
Okay.
Of form and telos. Telos and form are defined, are interdefined, okay? The quintessential defining element of modern philosophy is the rejection of the metaphysical reality of form and telos in favor of a mechanistic view of the world, okay? Descartes' dualism, therefore, has nothing to do with Plato's. Descartes' dualism is a result of the fact that the early mechanism was so crude, it was unclear how you could make space for mental properties within it. So the mental properties wind up being a hangover, but it is a result of the departure from ancient Greek philosophy. It is not in any way continuous with ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah, and I mean, the real crisis, I think, in modern philosophy was to take on these kind of mechanistic scientific insights and then to defend human freedom, right? Like, how is human freedom possible in a mechanical universe? That's the crisis of modern philosophy. Right,
but it's a crisis that is inevitable given the evolution of physics. Until you could understand that material reality, that physical reality was not only incomprehensible in terms of matter, but in terms of energy. Until you understood that, you couldn't even imagine how mind and mental processes could be a part of the physical universe, right?
Right.
So, in other words, what I'm saying is your account depends upon a completely revisionist understanding of how Descartes' dualism arises, right? And
well, no, because I think
connects it to the Greek in a way that I think is historically false.
All right, but surely the Plato is a dualist of some kind.
Yes.
And, and a mind-body dualist to boot. Okay, so however this arises, and whatever the ancillary metaphysical stuff is, like about is the world a mechanical system or, energy and so on, their view of what a human being is at least quite similar in terms of its overall form.
In Descartes' case, it is in a sense accidental. In Descartes' case, it is because Descartes is writing too early in the scientific revolution to understand that physicality need not entail materiality, right? However, right? Because once you understand that energy is also physical, then the idea that thoughts might be physical is no longer a strange idea, right? Right? It only is a strange idea when you think of physicality purely in terms of extension, right? Which is what Descartes does.
Right, true.
And so my point is that, look, if Descartes had been 100 years later, he wouldn't probably have been a dualist, right? Descartes was interested primarily in physics. And it was because the physics of his time could not make sense of the idea of thought processes that they were sort of put into this other category. I'm saying that Descartes is an accidental dualist. For Plato and the Greeks, the dualism is essential to the metaphysics because they view form and telos as being part of the world, right? Right.
Yeah.
So that's my objection to that. I think Descartes is being, in a sense, revised in a way that's false to the actual ideology of where his ideas come from.
Right, but however he arrived at that, he regards a human being as a combination of two sorts of things, one of which is suited to rule the other. And that's what Plato does too. Right. And then you get into Christine Korsgaard and shit like this.
Right. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later. Then how this all plays out. And but I want to do this step by step. And so the first thing is, you do understand that Descartes' dualism was not in a sense a prior design, right? It's not an idea. It's like, oh well, how am I going to make sense of why the white people are so much better than the black people? Well, I'll figure that I'll make this idea where, in other words, if Descartes is an accidental dualist, which I would argue is demonstrable from the arguments he gives for the dualism, okay, which are all having to do with mind not being extended, right?
Right.
Not having volume and other material properties, then at least we can say that to the extent to which Descartes' ideas might have been taken up by white supremacists, it's not freaking Descartes' fault, and it's not the history of philosophy's fault, right? Just like evolutionary biology was picked up by a bunch of racists, that doesn't make evolutionary biology racist, right?
Okay.
And I think you're making a similar mistake here. I think you're accusing philosophy of being racist because it might have been picked up by some racists later, and I just think that that's fair.
Right. Okay. And I'm not straight up calling Descartes a racist, and I didn't even go back and try to see if he said anything about this.
Well, he probably did, just because he was a creature of his
true.
time, right?
True. It's a vast oeuvre.
But that's not the reason why he's a dualist, right?
Right. But okay. Look, there's a cultural context in which and a political context and an economic context in which that philosophy is articulated. It's not only a reflection of the intellectual pressures of that moment, though it certainly is that. But there's also, say if you wanted to understand the essays of Montaigne or the plays of Shakespeare, you wouldn't say okay, what's going on politically in London or something is completely irrelevant to that, because Shakespeare is responding to Marlowe. Right? He's exploring drama like this and that.
Right. And Descartes is responding to the scholastics.
Right.
Okay.
Yes,
but that has nothing to do with racism.
No, he's also necessarily responding to the social and political situation that he's in. And I think that there are many, many symptoms of that in every philosophy.
Look, in general, I agree with you. You cannot take a person, the individual, out of the history of ideas. All that I'm saying is that, and you're absolutely right, Descartes coincides with, historically,
right,
the imperialist project. Okay,
right, and that's just guilt by association.
Right. What I'm saying is that that's coincidental. The relevant historical embeddedness of Descartes is the scientific revolution, particularly the mechanistic revolution. Okay, that's the relevant historical dimension of Descartes, not the colonization of Mexico, or that is not the orbit that Descartes is working in. Descartes is working within the first round of the scientific revolution. That's what he's
working with the European aristocracy that's engaged in the imperialist project. I mean, I don't know.
Do you really think that was Descartes' interest?
No. But I think that his philosophy reflects elaborately the power structures that he's in. And I think that's probably true in one way or another of most philosophies, or even all philosophies. It's an expression.
You don't think that's a revisionist treatment of Descartes?
I don't know if it's revisionist or not. I think it's contextualizing. It's more difficult with Descartes than if I'm yelling at Thomas Hobbes or something, or even Hume, who have these notorious moments where they directly address these questions.
I'm going to get to Hume in a minute, because I don't think Hume works for you very well. Hume has the opposite. Hume has the opposite problem. He really is kind of an obvious racist because he says these sorts of things. However, his philosophy is completely anti-dualist, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And he is, other than Kant, the most important philosopher of the Enlightenment. And so it doesn't. The other thing I was going to tell you is that I think your narrative is completely a caricature, right? I mean, it completely misrepresents. I would argue that there is as strong an anti-dualistic tradition running through the entire history of Western philosophy, starting with Aristotle, okay, as there is a dualist one. And so I also reject. I mean, maybe you want to get to this now. I reject your characterization of the arc of Western philosophy. I just think it's wrong. Right?
Okay, fair enough.
Selective, right? In a way that makes your point. But that kind of rubs me the wrong way. I don't expect that from my Crispin. I expect that from social justice agitator scholars. But you are furiously, ruthlessly independent. And I was a little disappointed at what struck me. I know you know this history as well as I do. Probably better.
I don't know.
And so, anyway, respond to that. I don't want to keep.
Partly maybe it's the term white supremacism itself, which is a very social justice warrior term and all of that.
It just gets thrown around like fucking candy, right? I mean,
I know.
Used to describe both, slavery and, a microaggression, right?
Yes, I know. I know.
Anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and in a way, I set it up that way intentionally, or to do this article struck me as soon as I slotted the word white supremacism in for racism. All right, you know what I mean? I use that term because it is so used in the contemporary discourse, and I thought it would be provocative or whatever. Okay, but okay, so Well, I mean, we can argue about this, but this is a very hard thing to argue about. I agree that there are many outbreaks of anti-dualism of many sorts, and that in Western philosophy, and there's a constant backlash against dualistic accounts. But I do think, like, the dualistic accounts, and I think that, I mean, I think that idealism ends up being fairly compatible with the kind of political undergirding that I'm identifying, actually.
Wait, I'm sorry, I just got distracted. Say that again, please.
Yeah.
It's my fault. It's my fault. I was thinking ahead and I lost you.
No, I didn't formulate that very clearly either. Like, I think that idealism grows out of dualism, like what, German idealism, and faces many of the same kinds of problems. But and I think of Kant as a kind of dualist, for example. All right.
I think that's fair. Although it's a very different kind of dualist.
Yeah, it's a hard question, right? It's not that simple. All right, but and so I guess in my follow up to that piece, I listed some figures I think who are outside of that in various ways, like Diogenes, the Cynic. I mean, this might be true of Aristotle to some extent.
A lot of the Hellenistic philosophers were more materialists. They were monists.
Yeah, I mean,
and Aristotle naturalizes the formal elements of Plato, and so Aristotle is a proto-naturalist. I mean, he doesn't have the conceptual framework and the vocabulary to sort of make that move. But I have no doubt that if he was around at a much later time, he would have been Quine, right? I mean, he would have been.
Maybe. He's still got mind ruling, kind of. You know what I mean?
But he puts form into matter. He detranscendentalizes it, right?
Yes.
But
I would say Spinoza, for example. I mean, right up in Descartes' face. And
Hume is profoundly, he's not just profoundly anti-metaphysical, being anti-dualist. He goes even farther. He goes right at that one thing that you're talking about the most. He subordinates reason to the passions.
Yeah, true. That's really true.
And Hume is not small. My point is, why isn't it a fair response to you to say, only half the philosophical tradition is this, the other half isn't?
Maybe that is a better way to put it. I mean, especially when you start thinking about my favorites like Nietzsche or... of course, all these people have some kind of complex relation to whatever forms of oppression were going on in their own lifetimes and stuff like that. I guess I read... I mean, I don't know if I thought about this hard enough or even how you would pay this off short of a 1,000-page book. But I guess I do see the dualist tradition as fundamental in various ways.
I think it's dominant. Look, you might be right. I mean, that's a judgment call.
Yeah, but Plato and Descartes... I mean, Plato and Descartes, like, that's pretty much the dawn of ancient and the dawn of modern philosophy.
I don't know. You could say Aristotle and Hume just as convincing.
Yes, you could. And it would probably do better.
I would argue that the latter pairing are the better philosophers. I mean, they're better pairing.
I agree.
Plato's a great writer.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's anywhere in the same universe as Aristotle intellectually.
I agree. The arguments are so much better in Aristotle, actually.
Hume is such a more sophisticated. To me, Descartes' most impressive work is the stuff we don't remember, and that's all the work he did in the physics.
That's hard reading.
Like this, and the stuff in terms of scientific, in terms of method. Hume is the much better, more sophisticated philosopher, it seems to me. Let me ask you I'm sorry, go ahead. You go ahead, and then I want to ask you one more thing about the history before we move forward. Go ahead, though.
I guess what I see running through much of the history of Western thought and culture and religion is a privileging of the intellectual over the physical, and an attempt to distinguish human beings in principle from the order of nature.
I would agree with that, but I think that is only coincidentally related to racism.
I think that's the very structure of racism. Like, that's the content of racism, that the intellectual should subordinate the physical. The intellectual is high and pure, and the physical is low and degraded. and the intellectual should rule the physical. I think, even elements of Christianity and Judaism and stuff like show bits of that. So like that's
what I was going to ask you. Actually, I was going to ask you why you're attributing this dualism to Western philosophy as opposed to Abrahamic religion, right? I mean, in other words, It seems to me that the very heavily normative dimension of the dualism.
Yes.
A lot of what you were saying at the beginning sounded to me a lot more like St. Paul than like Descartes.
Yes.
And so,
right, but if you're
part of the awkwardness of that, and I think I know why you didn't do it. It doesn't help you very much because the primary liberatory framework of African Americans in the history of the United States is the church.
I didn't really think about that. I guess I may have. I should, but
why do you not attribute it to Christianity? I'm a little surprised that you're saddling poor Descartes with this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it's not that St. Paul or Augustine were completely outside of the Hellenistic world and stuff either.
No, absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. I mean, they're running the Plato thing a little bit too. I mean, I don't know about Paul really, but a bit, I think. So I think they run together. And, I think that's maybe Descartes' basic defense against the charge of blasphemy or whatever, is that, look, basically I'm teaching traditional Christianity in a way.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Look, there's no question that, look, this is the thing, right? I mean, you get Christianity from the kind of out of the Hellenization of Judaism. Now, Judaism doesn't have these dualisms.
No, it doesn't really. No.
In Judaism, it's very earthy. It's probably somewhat incoherent by virtue of being earthy in that way. But the whole thing of ensoulment in Judaism is really more like the animation of dirt, right? I mean,
it's much more complex, right? And it's and it is less flatly dualistic for sure.
I don't disagree with you that the Christian version is heavily influenced by, Neoplatonic and other sort of other ideas that comes out of the syncretism that emerges.
Right.
That's just boiling in that Hellenistic cauldron there.
And Descartes still trying to negotiate that, right? He's still trying to make this, compatible with Christian theology or whatever.
Yes, and that's in the sense that he's the bridge between the scholastics and the modern era. I think that's right. I just find it. I just was a little wondering why I'm reading about Descartes and not about Pauline, Pauline Hellenization of the body.
Right.
And the elevation of the spirit and the whole idea of materiality being inherently corrupt and all this sort of, the fallen world, all of this sort of stuff.
True.
And I think you get a very different story.
But all of these elements run together to form like a basic sort of Western conceptual framework of the universe, which I think is reflected in the structure of racism as it emerges.
Okay, so that's a key element, right? So here's what I guess I'm wondering, and that is, I would agree with you on your more general characterization. If you want to characterize Western thought, let's say, not just philosophy, but Western thought, as having as a core element the idea of the conquest of nature.
Yes,
I would agree with that, right?
And the kind of devaluing of nature. I
would argue, however, well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is in terms of what I would think is a much more, how shall I say, morally positive humanism, right? I mean, you have to remember the extent to which human misery and immiseration is the product of its confrontation with nature, right? It's not just, there's two basic sources of human immiseration, right? One is other people, but the other is nature. It's all very well to get all on your high horse about industrialization, but it's what doubled the human lifespan, right?
Yeah.
So I just think there's a bit of a kind of well, we're here comfortable sitting in the most advanced developed world in the world. We get to live to be 85, 90 years old, and now we're going to sit here and nobilize all the savages and run Rousseauian fantasies about pre-industrial society. And the whole thing has an aura of unreality to it that I think that worries me and is a little bit of a surprise to me coming from you. Because I thought that you're a very hard-nosed, kind of cynical, you don't buy bullshit too quickly, and you recognize propaganda when you see it. And I don't know, there was a whiff of propaganda about all of this. This what you're doing here. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I've
admitted I tried to be provocative.
I mean, I love you too much, man. And I saw this. I'm like, what is he doing?
I know.
He's like some. So what's? Do you not see the sort of the problem? The conquest of nature.
Yeah.
That idea is easily be given a very moral, humane spin as it can be the negative one you're choosing to give it by shackling it to racism, right?
Right. But it is shackled to racism, if you ask me. And it's shackled to environmental disaster, exploitation of animals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I do take your point, though. Like, you know, in 1600, the basic challenge of human life is to deal with or overcome natural obstacles, or,
right.
You know,
you get an infection, you either die or you lose a limb, right?
Right.
A flu epidemic comes through, everybody gets killed. Now, I view the idea of the conquest of nature as a deeply humanistic idea. Now, the fact that
it's a good way to destroy the world as a whole.
Right, but the thing is that then hopefully what happens as you get smarter, as you get better at it. And look, I mean, we now have a very, very robust environmentalist movement, right? I mean, in other words, I guess I'm not sure what you're expecting of history, right?
All right, but okay, so one thing is, I just think that it's false, like, to go metaphysical, that the idea of a profound gap between the human and the natural is completely unsustainable. Like, it's not, I feel like it's, like, obviously false. It's like, once you read Darwin or something, you can certainly not continue along these lines. All right, like, we are particular species of animals. We're not separated from the order of nature in any respect at any moment.
Not metaphysically, we're not, but I mean,
right. So the metaphysics is false.
We are.
The metaphysics is false. Okay, so let's start with that. Like, even if they needed it for comprehensible reasons, one thing is how endangering nature is, but the other is, when we're conquering nature, we're also engaged specifically in the project of conquering the world, okay, and the other people in the world, and associating them with nature. Okay, so, like, this thing comes with a hierarchy. Like, it always comes with a value hierarchy that privileges mind, or privileges even just the human, over every other aspect of reality. And I think that is pathological. I think it's sick. I think it's false. And I think it's liable to lead us to annihilation.
Have you read Bernard Williams' The Human Prejudice?
I've read a bunch of Williams, but maybe not that one.
Okay, so this is stuff that was done pretty much at the end of his life. It was very late. And I always teach this essay after teaching all the Peter Singer animal welfare stuff.
Yeah, what's the title of the essay?
The Human Prejudice.
Okay.
And one of the things that I like about it is that it makes us understand, you know, I don't disagree that, let's call it humanism, because that's what it is, right? I mean, we're talking descriptively about humanism, right? In its classic traditional sense, right? Humanism as in the Renaissance, as it's understood in the Renaissance, not humanism in its current form, which is identified with atheism. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the classic traditional humanism, right? And there was a Christian version in the Middle Ages, right, of it.
And the 20th century too, like personalism.
Yeah. Look, I will not disagree with you that humanism gives rise to certain, let's call them, broadly speaking, environmentally catastrophic results.
Yeah.
About which we are rightly concerned. The problem is that the very intelligibility of the concerns being articulated are themselves only possible in light of the human prejudice. In other words, and what Williams' whole point is that moral concern is an expression of the human prejudice. It is an expression of humanism. It's not something that floats in the logical space above right?
Okay.
Right there, nothing is good from the view from nowhere, right? And the fact of the matter is, the only reason there is concern for animal welfare is because of the human prejudice, right? The only reason there is concern for the animals aren't concerned with animal welfare. The baboons are not concerned with the welfare of whoever the hell it is they ate yesterday, right?
Well, I don't know about that.
Expression of human. Well, listen.
I mean, the baboons are concerned with the welfare of other baboons. Maybe
next time you have a conversation with the baboon chief, you can report to me back what he told you. I don't believe that you know anything about what the baboons are motivated by, because we can't have.
Well, you're making claims about it.
We can't. I'm only claiming the absence of a motivation. I'm saying I know.
Right.
There is a motivation, and that is there's a human motivation to be concerned about these things. Once I'm acquainted with baboon concerns, I might say that Williams is wrong, right? But I've not been so acquainted, and I doubt I will be anytime soon, right?
Well, you can read some of the research. I mean, what does Diane Fossey think that gorillas have no concerns? Or that they're.
I'm not saying they have no concerns. I'm saying they don't have ethical concerns of the sort that we are articulating when we express concern about the environment, about animal welfare, about whatever it is, right? I mean, just go look in your backyard and look at the animals running around and how they're acting and what they're doing, right? I mean, this whole sphere of concern is an expression of human concern. Listen, it's even in the language. What do we call the organization whose job it is to make sure animals are treated properly?
Okay, the
Humane Society. The Humane Society.
Yeah. Yeah, treat them humanely.
Right. I mean, so
well, look, it's human beings. It's human beings that are doing this thinking. We're human beings talking about this.
That's right.
But that doesn't undergird the legitimacy of a metaphysical distinction between human selves and the natural world. Do you see what I mean? Like,
I agree with that, but that's already been junked. There are very few analytic philosophers,
right,
that are going to accept the idea that human beings are metaphysically dualistic, right? I mean,
all right. Well, I disagree with this. I think that there's all kinds of hangover from that.
Oh, I agree. There's hangover.
Yeah,
but that's not the same as saying that contemporary analytic philosophers are dualists.
I think they're dualistic enough to be getting along with. So, like when people do the free will problem, I quoted John Martin Fisher and Christine Korsgaard in the piece, and I would, I could throw you some Derek Parfit and things like this. They say like they start out with this question. It's the same question as Aristotle or whatever. What makes us different and so much better than the other animal species? And the answer is mind, dude. It's self-consciousness and self-control, all right, which gives our actions moral content and makes them more significant and makes us more morally valuable than any other thing in nature. All right, I say that's just imports, it's strictly speaking, it could be compatible with some kind of naturalism, although I think I don't think it is really. But it's just the same thing as Kant and Descartes. It's potentially, strictly speaking, compatible with some kind of naturalistic metaphysics. It still has, first of all, it still emerges from a political vision in which the experts or the philosopher kings or the Harvard professors should be running the whole show. Okay. And it has repressed that origin. It pretends to be talking about kind of moral philosophy or the free will problem in an abstract sense. But what it reflects social hierarchies like like all these metaphysics do. All right. And it basically has a mind-body distinction, and it rates mind as extremely valuable and body as degraded. And I don't think it's, you can't be a metaphysical substance dualist at this point in philosophy, but you can do everything else kind of, you know what I mean? And have the same disastrous political implications in what seems to be a completely apolitical moral philosophy, metaphysical philosophy, etc.
Look, it's fine. I find myself, having to disagree with you on something that I think in another context of discussion I probably agree with you with, and that is, look, as a Wittgensteinian, I certainly would agree with you that there are a lot of Cartesian remnants especially explanatorily, right? And so I would actually accept a kind of explanatory dualism that I think is misunderstood. In other words, I accept a kind of explanatory pluralism, right? But I think that the explanatory dualism that I'm talking about, that we see today, especially in the philosophy of mind, and then the philosophy of action, is mistaken and is a holdover to what you're talking from what you're talking about. But
so what kind of figures or explanatory dualism, like?
Well, so like, the sort of to explain actions by reference to prior events inside your head is a kind of explanatory dualism, as opposed to sort of a Ryleyan treatment of actions, right? In which it's understood that what is being referred to as an antecedent is actually a post hoc explanation, right? I mean, it's sort of quasi-behaviorist. I mean, Wittgenstein is not a behaviorist, but it breaks with the explanatory dualism. So I mean, I would accept sort of all of that.
So like human action has to be explained teleologically, essentially, in this view, right? Like what you're intended to do, what you're trying to accomplish. Right. Now, whereas the action of a squirrel or whatever, or a tree, does not require that kind of explanation. Yeah.
That's right. Now, actually, my views on this are much more complicated, because I do accept the sort of Salarzian distinction between the manifest and the scientific, and I think it actually makes a very important point. I don't think that human actions are actually reducible to motor movements and all that sort of thing. And so I have a very complicated story to tell about all that, but it's not relevant to what we're talking about here. All I wanted to say was that at a certain level within a different conversation, I agree with you that there are dualistic leftovers in philosophy that are problematic. Okay.
Yeah.
But in this context, so everything you just said about mastery of yourself, of nature, and mind ruling over body and all of that, I mean, you can make it sort of sound very ominous and sinister with respect to tying it to this tradition that you talk about, and then to the racism that gets, because black people are treated like they're just bodies, and so the minds which the white people have to rule over the people who just have the bodies and no minds. But the problem is that strikes me also as rather, I don't want to say cherry picking, but because look, you've raised children, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so have I. And you can see the results of it, right? And the my premature aging, right? Now look, certainly part of what you're doing when you're raising children is trying to get them to master their inclinations, right? Is trying to get them to be able to exercise self-control. The language very often and correctly represents this as whether it's the delaying of gratification, or whether it's the 5-second rule, or whether it's whatever, is that your better considerations, which mean your reflective states of consciousness, right, should acquire some mastery over your knee-jerk instinctual reactions, okay? And this, indeed, I would argue, is what characterizes maturation in a healthy, normal human being, all right? Now, there's nothing sinister about this. There's nothing metaphorical about it. It's perfectly well represented.
And there's not necessarily anything racist about it.
Not at all. And you have to do a lot of work to load that down with metaphysics, and then go trotting off with it like an overloaded pack mule over to the racism conversation. And that's what I feel a little bit like you're doing. I feel like you're taking this stuff, all of which on its own and independently has perfectly reasonable and understandable historical. And I guess the whole wrap-up of this is, I don't understand why what you're doing is any better than saying that evolutionary biology is racist because some racists made use of evolutionary biological ideas.
Okay, well, it does have an element of that. In other words, like I'm saying...
Is that interesting?
Yes, it's interesting. For one thing, because I think it elucidates the conceptual structure of racism. I think if you want to understand what racism is, you're going to do a lot better after you look at it through the structure of, if you understand it in terms, for example, of Cartesian dualism, or in terms of Kantianism. Like, I think it gives you an understanding. And I also think that it's not a coincidence that all these kinds of metaphysical structures, which don't necessarily entail racism, emerge in a society that is racist and has a racist hierarchy. Like, I don't think that's a coincidence in various ways. I think the racism feeds the metaphysics, and the metaphysics feeds the racism.
Yeah, but it's exactly the first statement that I thought all of these painstaking examples I've been pulling out was designed to contest, right? And I don't know that you contested any of them on the individual merits, and yet you're still saying that as a whole. In other words, I've contested that the metaphysics is motivated by the racism. I don't deny that the racism exploits some of the metaphysics, but that's no different than the way that racists exploit evolutionary biology, right? That doesn't mean that there's something that racism motivates evolutionary biology. Now, if Cartesian dualism is motivated primarily by mechanistic physics, and if talk about mastering yourself is motivated mostly by just sort of good old common sense child rearing and self-control, right? And if the conquest of nature is largely an expression of the effort to sort of reduce human immiseration, right? Then I don't see how you've made a case that the racism informs the metaphysics.
All right. If we were okay. The causation that leads to, say, Kant's philosophical system or Descartes is immensely complicated, right? And a lot of it comes internally from like a series of pressures that are emerging in science and, philosophy at that moment, or even in theology. But I also think that typically these philosophies, even in their super abstract metaphysical moments, also reflect the political systems in which they emerge, the economic relations in which they emerge, in like a very subtle and complex way. So I think that the concept of the human self in Plato is a reflection of his political philosophy. Okay? And I sort of think that...
I think that's fair. Yes, look.
And I think that
this is an aristocrat and an anti-democrat, right? So yes, of course, yes.
I think so, yeah. So it kind of comes from that. And I also think that, and I think this picture where... Yes, I think the picture of a human being as basically a self-control problem, like as several different things, 3 of them or 5 of them, and one of them that has to be the ruler, and the others that have to be the servants or the slaves. I mean, I understand what you're saying about child rearing. I think there's other
individual's development arc, right? I mean, from a child, infant, toddler, up through until hopefully an ethical, productive adult, right?
Right,
but it's all about self-mastery.
No. I mean, no. A perfectly self-mastered person is also not recognizable as human. And what is mastering what, man? Like, how many parts do I have, and what has to subordinate what? And why am I thinking of myself as this oppression machine, where part of myself needs to subdue the other parts of myself? I don't really experience it that way. I experience it, sometimes I have these kind of divisions. And I think this is true in child rearing and stuff too. It's going to be a negotiation, man. And also you might want to think about not just chopping up people into the high part that is suited to control and the other parts that must be subordinated for maturation or something like that. I think that's kind of an ill picture, and it's a lot more complex than that. All right. Like, for example, did you see this 23-year-old Olympic medalist bike rider who committed suicide a month or 2 ago?
No, I don't know.
I don't know. I've just been reading articles about her. And she was raised by super structured parents who demanded absolute self-control at every moment. They didn't permit their kids, for example, to watch movies unless they were on an exercise machine and stuff like this. She got utterly driven. I mean, so she got perfect SAT scores. She was completely self-controlled, as her friends describe her, every minute of every day. Okay. And then she killed herself. Okay. That's not a way I want to think about myself. And it's not the way I want to think about human beings. It's like, I've got this faculty that is suited to rule because it's intellectual or whatever. Now I got to subdue my toes. Okay. Like that, I'm looking at myself at that point like a political hierarchy in which bits are, suited to rule other bits. Now, that doesn't necessarily get you straight to racism. I think it kind of emerges from racism, though, but they're really isomorphic in the same culture at the same moment. I don't think that's the way, like, people in many other cultures have conceived the human self. And I think it's kind of an ill way to conceive the self. And I think it goes back to Plato and shit, man.
Yeah, I think you're connecting things together and giving a very Baroque characterization that I just want to just put back up my very simple description. Last week we're having particularly fun times with our 17-year-old because we're at that even most fun of times when she's starting her senior year. She's got to take her SATs. She's got to apply to colleges.
I was just there 2 years ago, man. Yeah.
And so we're really having a great time. And I just, this week, after several rounds of, fights and emotional explosions and all this, I said to my wife, I said, I realize now, I said, basically, this is very simple. When I can control myself, this goes well. When I react to Victoria, when I react to my daughter, as if I'm reacting to a real contestant or to a real challenger or to a peer or something, it all goes to shit in a minute. And what did I mean? I meant something like self-mastery right now. Yeah. That doesn't entail anything metaphysical. It doesn't entail this picture that you've painted. It doesn't require any Plato. It just, and it seems to me that you're gluing things together to try to create a picture. I accept the idea that the Western philosophical tradition parts of it have been used by racists and imperialists and so on and so forth. I might even agree that some of the philosophy itself arose out of these programs, let's call them, right?
Yeah.
But the bulk of the tradition that you talk about in the essay, Descartes, I don't think so, right? Even when they do say race, Hume says all kinds of racist stuff, but to say that his philosophy is primarily a racist project just strikes me as demonstrably.
I think that's wrong. That would be wrong too. Can I press?
Yeah, you say whatever you want. Go ahead.
Can I press a little bit on the connection that you get in so much contemporary philosophy?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's talk about the contemporary. Yeah, let's talk about it.
Self-mastery and self-control and freedom.
Okay.
So that's how Course Guard defines freedom. It's how...
Of course, she's a Kantian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that okay, you are free when you can control yourself, when you can assert self-control. Now, I think that's a ridiculous picture of human freedom. It's utterly wrong.
It's only ridiculous philosophically, but it's not ridiculous in the version that I just described before, right?
Oh, like sort of a common sense, get a hold of yourself moment or something like that?
How much of maturation and successful social negotiation involves self-mastery, right?
Okay, can I say why I think that's a ridiculous philosophical conception now?
Yes.
It's because, it divides you into two parts. The part that is controlling and the part that is controlled. It's a picture of self-enslavement exactly as much as it is a picture of liberation.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you are the lawgiver of yourself in a Kantian way, and you are always responsive to your own commands, I don't think that that's, capitulation to the law that you give yourself is not any kind of vision of human freedom, okay? And it does divide you into a master and a slave, all right? And it defines freedom as the master crushing the slave, all right? Like that is nothing, and it's not phenomenologically a good picture of human freedom too. because just as often as maybe imposing constraints could be, or much more plausibly than imposing constraints is a form of freedom, is bursting constraints is a form of freedom. So when you violate the law that you give yourself, that is often when you would have a sensation of liberation, right? Like when you lose your self-consciousness and just dance or something like that. Or when you transgress the moral principles that you are trying to impose on yourself or that other people are trying to impose on you. That is often when the sensation of liberation and acting from free will occurs. I think that these ideas, the philosophies that tightly connect self-control to freedom, free will, are just kind of obviously wrong. But that is the dominant theme. Like, I don't know what kind of people they are. I think they're self-deluded people if Christine Korsgaard thinks that she has mastered her desires, whoever she is, outside of all those desires or whatever, with no body, or, and if she wants to call that freedom, I just think she's wrong, and she's ill, and she's creating a self that is an internal site of just the same kind of oppression that we inflict on, women, Black people, Native Americans, whatever. Like, I think, so anyway, I have a very hostile response to this whole series of moves. And it does seem to be the consensus in the current moral philosophy and free will.
I don't know. I was under the impression that most analytic philosophers today are either determinists or compatibilists. I am not under the impression that most analytic philosophers today accept the Kantian radical notion of freedom that requires a kind of a noumenal self. I mean,
right.
Korsgaard's is obviously a modernized version. Look, Korsgaard just strikes me as sort of the best of the worst philosophers, right? I mean, in the sense that, anybody who's still carrying the water of either Mill or Kant clearly didn't understand or missed what happened in the 20th century, right? I mean, I don't see how anybody who's read.
They're kind of back, though.
I don't know how anybody who's read either Pritchard or Ross could possibly still be carrying that water now, or Anscombe for that matter. Hold on one second.
Yeah.
Hold on a second.
Sure.
It's my dog is letting herself in.
Yeah.
And I agree with Anscombe that the notion of self-legislation is completely incoherent.
Oh, good. You should read that in Anscombe.
Yeah. Anscombe says that in Modern Moral Philosophy, in the essay Modern Moral Philosophy. Yeah. But again, my inclination, and maybe this is just part of what's going on here, is that you and I just do philosophy very differently. So what I'm always interested in is recovering what makes sense of it in it, right? And to me, all you need to do is strip the Kantian insights of some of their metaphysical exotica, and you get really, really interesting, and I think in some ways deeply true understandings. Look.
Well, that's what Korsgaard thinks too.
It's a very easy view of freedom to say that it's a liberation, that it's a liberation to your desires, right?
Right.
A liberation of it from external rules with regard to your desires, right? Mm-hmm. That's the 1960s view of freedom, right?
Yes.
But I also think that there's a really valuable insight into Kant, and that is, well, wait a minute. There also is a kind of liberation and resistance to your desires, right? Now, of course, that's just the expression of another set of desires.
Sure.
But it's an interesting problematization, which is probably not a word, of this what I would call naive view of freedom, right? In other words, Kant problematizes freedom in a way that I think ultimately is illuminating, so long as you don't take too seriously some of the systematic elements, which, by the way, is why I'm opposed to systematic philosophy. And so I always choose to sort of look at it in that light, and maybe I'm inclined more to find the Kant star that makes sense, inside the historical Kant, which doesn't, right?
Yeah.
And It's a very analytic thing to do, right? I mean,
yeah. And when I'm reading the history of philosophy, I'm usually looking for whom I can destroy. Right. You know what I mean? Like, how can I?
Resentful, and I'm not.
Yeah.
Well, you just posted about how bitter and resentful you are.
Yes, I did.
You don't care if there's any philosophy departments in 50 years.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this one last thing while we're on this, and because you did say that you are kind of saying this, and I want to ask you whether you think this is really a fair thing to do. So I asked you, why shouldn't I think that really all you're doing is saying that, well, there are some bad people who have used philosophical ideas for bad reasons? Why isn't that just like saying, well, there's bad people who have used Darwinian evolutionary biology for bad reasons?
Well, I think it's a little worse than that.
It's unfair to saddle the science with that, right? And
yeah.
Why is it fair to saddle Western philosophy with this if some of the arguments I've been making about the actual historical and theoretical ideologies of a lot of these theories, why is it not? Why are you not engaging in a kind of very common? So let me just give you an example, right? So one of the things I'm involved in, and I just got sucked into this entirely accidentally, is these damn gender identification wars. And the reason I got drawn in was entirely the trans stuff.
Yeah.
The reason I got drawn into is entirely accidental. A person who I know and very much like over from the UK, and I know her from aesthetics, Kathleen Stock, right?
Yeah.
I've known her for years because I used to go to British Society of Aesthetics meetings every year, and she was a essential player. And I just started seeing her getting savaged on social media. And my inclination is always to defend my friends, and so I just sort of I went running in,
Yeah.
I only then found out what the whole thing was about later. But a very common thing that these gender activists will say is, "Oh, you're a transphobe because you're using arguments that are sometimes used by other people."
Right.
Now, I find that to be deeply demagogic, right? I mean, that in my view is a demagogic tactic.
It's trying to silence you, basically.
Tell me why you're not engaged in that kind of demagoguery with respect to this. That's the last challenge I'm going to throw at you about this.
I mean, like I say, I think there's an element of fairness in that. Like, because it sounds like I'm just straight up calling Descartes a racist, or whatever. And not in virtue of anything he said about race at all, or thought about race, right, but in virtue of like this abstract metaphysical theory. And the fact that abstract metaphysical theory is reflected in many expressions of racism or something like that,
right,
that's not Descartes' fault, and right, et cetera. I mean, I think that's fairly fair. I mean, my overall diagnosis of the West, though, is that it's informed by varieties of political and economic oppression very thoroughly from very early, and that you see symptoms of that in all kinds of places that you might not expect it. You know what I mean? Or that, or where it's not explicit. So, like I say, like these hierarchical visions of the human self. Now, first of all, a hierarchical vision of the human self in which there's the faculty that should control and the faculties that should be controlled and stuff like that. It doesn't necessarily have direct political implications. It doesn't even necessarily emerge from political problems or something like that. But the way it runs through the Western tradition, I say, consistently shows it connected to forms of Western oppression. Like the basic forms of Western oppression are very similar to the basic structures of Western metaphysics throughout. So like whether I'm accusing someone of being a racist, like Plato, you damn racist or whatever, or white supremacist, is less interesting to me than sort of like trying to shed light on like the whole atmosphere that is kind of like saying what the world is, what the human self is, and that's reflecting, if you ask me, very often and like pretty directly, or even like sort of obviously, structures of oppression, including the idea that, for example, the experts should rule, or that, the educated or the intellectual types or the mindish types should control the body types and stuff like that. So I'm not, I pull back from like, you racist Immanuel Kant, or whatever, unless I can find a quote where he expresses that directly, and there are such quotes, I guess. But
which he does, but it doesn't have anything to do with it. It doesn't have to do with anything with causality being a category, right? I mean, it's.
I don't know about that.
I mean, yeah, I guess they just. I don't like the way that this is being used in contemporary politics, and so I don't, and it occurs to me, I agree with everything that you just characterized about Western civilization, and I would say, it's the worst civilization except for all the others, right? I mean, in the sense that, look, I mean, I also wonder whether a properly, correctly emphasized self-criticism can easily be misinterpreted as some sort of distinctive or unique quality. In other words, I think that what you would discover if you did a fair-minded survey of all the human civilizations on the planet is that they were all fucking horrible to themselves and to each other, right? Now, I do think, in other words, I really highly doubt that if the Chinese were any better to their peasants than the West was, I mean, or to anybody else's peasants that they wound up, whose orbit wound up falling under their own. Now, I do think one correctly emphasizes the wrongness of one's own, right? I mean, that's that your job is to keep your house in order first, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But I do think that there is a kind of self-villainization that's happening that goes far beyond that. And that has in part to do with this revisionist and, in my view, misleading take on the history of ideas, right? That I don't think you do, but I think is easily done. I always want to stay on the side of that line, right? People ask me why I'm always attacking Democrats, and the answer is, well, because that's my party.
Yeah.
The Republicans can go deal with their own fucking assholes. I have to deal with my fucking assholes, right?
And that's why I'm like often attacking the Western tradition or white people or men or
Right. But what I would really worry about is this idea that, Western philosophy has this special quality, and it's the reason why Western civilization is this especially terrible civilization. I am absolutely certain that if we did just an excruciating analysis of China and its intellectual tradition, you'd find just as much rotten shit, right, all over the place, or Japan or whoever, right? I mean, whoever it is you want. I mean,
well, look, man,
that's the Western nature of human civilization, right? I mean, that's just.
Well, okay, but I think that's too easy, man. I mean, Western civilization, and in the period we're talking about, like the modern philosophy period, is subduing the entire planet. Okay, like that's not something that even the Chinese did, really. You know what I mean? Or the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, it's not that there weren't terrible things. But these are particularly colonialism.
What about the Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, this is true. And I think
don't tell me if you go into sub-Saharan Africa and look at the history of how these people treated each other before anybody white ever showed up. That it was that, in other words, there's a very easy and phony kind of noble savage narrative going on.
I know, and I'm not doing that, I hope.
No, you're not. But what I'm saying is I worry that this crosses over from correct emphasis on self-criticism to some sort of a notion of unique villainy in the history of human civilization that I just don't buy it.
Okay, what King Leopold did in the Congo is not something Africans ever did to each other. He killed millions of people or worked them to death in the mines and stuff like that. Okay? I mean, and actually, if you think about the great genocides and the unbelievable world wars, they seem to arise basically out of Western civilization, all right?
But that's certainly a coincidence of time and industrialization. And in other words, don't tell me if these other people hadn't industrialized first. And in other words, I don't believe that human nature just varies that much. In the sense of the capacity to be murderous, shitty, murderous, horrible people. I think it's pretty universally shared amongst the human population. I mean, I think a lot of the distinctive modern horrors are products of industrialization. And all that then entails socially and politically, and it's where modern bureaucracy comes out of. It's where the whole organization of you're right. Look, you can't get the kind of horror you get out of German mass extermination without bureaucracy, management.
True.
It's Kafka plus the Industrial Revolution, right?
Plus Western political theory.
One group of Rwandans managed to murder 800,000 other groups of Rwandans in 2 weeks with machetes, right?
Yes.
We are very capable.
That's true.
Of being fucking horrible to each other.
No, that's really true.
I just don't want to look. There's so much in the tradition that you are attacking here that, in my view, provides the best case for human liberation. I don't think that any better case for human liberation has been made than that of the liberal tradition.
Okay.
And I just want to be careful. I fear that the liberal tradition is already come under such a sustained attack from progressive activists.
Yeah.
That we're losing sight of the fact that, again, it's the worst political philosophy except for all the others.
It has. I have criticisms of that tradition. But I think you're right. And I think that one thing that kind of goes wrong in my piece or whatever is I'm just waving off the entire Western tradition. And I'm kind of saying it's uniquely evil and stuff like that. And I think that's sort of a fair criticism. Like it's too global, too quick.
I make fun of the utilitarians all the time, but damn it, they were important in the history of liberatory movements, okay? Mill was arguing for women's rights early.
And Bentham for animal rights.
And prison reform and all sorts of stuff
true.
that I think right-minded people should appreciate. And when I look at the civil rights movements of the 60s, I see primarily the liberatory ideas of the liberal tradition, not the progressive tradition, okay? The progressive tradition was tied up with eugenics and all kinds of when I hear Martin Luther King, when I read those speeches, I'm hearing the expression of the best ideas within the liberal tradition combined with the humanistic side of Christianity. That's what I'm seeing.
Right.
And
there's a prophetic, spiritual, faith-based side of it.
I don't want to sully that. I'm worried about sullying that in the current climate. I
have more reservations about liberalism probably, but
yeah, we should probably do a dialogue on that. Because the older I get, the more I'm thinking that it's the best we've done, despite the fact that it's got all sorts of problems. But I've yet to hear a better explanation of why we should treat other people well, especially people who are not our intimates, who are not our friends, who are not. I just worry that the way I feel like I'm watching the disintegration of the traditional civil rights coalition into a set of warring factions, and part of the reason is because of the abandonment of traditional liberal ideas.
Okay.
And so your essay scared me a little bit, in that it's not that I haven't heard that before; it's that I haven't heard it from people like you before.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, that it's wonderful though, because you and I get to have this kind of conversation, and we get to cover a lot of territory, and
because we live in a liberal society.
Yeah, we're allowed to have this conversation.
Damn it. All right.
So, Crispin, I wish you the best of luck with your upcoming semester.
You too, man.
I wish all of us the best of luck with our upcoming semesters. What are your enrollments? How many students you got this term?
It's been a week or two since I looked, I guess, but I think my intro section is full, like 35 maybe. But I'm teaching a section. I'm teaching a course on Confucius and Confucianism. That probably only has.
You're going to enjoy that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so. It has 5 students, I think, and I'm teaching 19th century philosophy, which I think has 12 or something.
Oh, so you've got 3 preps this semester.
Yeah.
I've got a giant section of intro with 90 people.
Oh, golly.
And then I'm teaching a course. It's a course that I have regularly teach in a rotation every other year, Philosophical Ideas in Literature, the entire course of which consists of novels by Philip K. Dick.
Really?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I fucking love it. I mean,
That's not a bad idea.
I've taught various iterations of this course. So the last version of the course I taught was sort of a dark look at the American dream. So I did like Nathaniel West and John Gideon and Hunter S. Thompson and Bret Easton Ellis.
Oh, wow.
One of the books I did in that course was Philip K. Dick's Scanner Darkly. And the reaction to that was so strong. So I'm like, why don't we just do a whole course on Dick?
Yeah.
And so I'm doing a whole course on Dick now, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So,
you can bring all kinds of philosophy out of Philip K. Dick.
He's a gold mine. I don't know how much of him you've read, but
it's been a long time.
He's a gold mine. He's like, I think Ursula Le Guin described him as our Kafka, but he goes farther than that. I mean, he's not as good of a writer as Kafka.
Yeah.
His concerns include Kafka's and then many more outside of that. And so, you can get tons of mileage. I mean, we do Man in the High Castle.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That whole dialogue you and I had about the factuality of history.
Yes.
That's the conversation I have with students when we do Man in the High Castle.
That's great, man.
What actually happened, and what does it mean to say that this actually happened?
Yeah.
And then with androids, obviously we do personhood and all this sort of stuff. And so it's wonderful. It's a wonderful opportunity. Anyway, Crispin, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.
We'll see you again soon. And I hope I wasn't a jerk, was I?
No, and I think it went pretty well, man. I don't know.
No, I enjoyed it tremendously. I wanted to be tough because I did get upset, but I didn't want to be a jerk to you. And I hope I succeeded.
You weren't at all.
I hope so.
You were milder than I expected.
Okay. Take care, my friend, and we'll see you again soon.
Take it easy, buddy.
All right, bye-bye.